Yes, thank you all for getting up this early. How many know John Miller, the guy that runs our journalism program? Okay. Don't tell him this, but John and I are in a contest where every month you have to pay the other guy $1 if they're ahead of you in Twitter accounts. So if you would follow me on Twitter, and if you're following John, if you could just unfollow him, that would be great. Now, at the end of this session, we're going to know more about Bitcoins than probably 98% of all Americans. That 2% either has pocket protectors or they have a seaplane that takes them to Martha's Vineyard for the weekend. Two of the authors are going to tell us a little bit about whether Bitcoin is money or will it become money and what money is. And the other is going to tell us the mechanics, basically, of how it works. And I was just thinking that Hayek would be fairly intrigued with the idea of Bitcoins. And in 1976, he wrote a little book called The Denationalization of Money, in which he called for private monies and said, we don't need central banks to do this. And the primary reason is he felt that central banking was the cause for business cycles, that central banks interfered with the price system in the following way. If you, again, Anita told you about our online courses. If you get on the Econ 101 online course and you look for Lecture 9 on Austrian business cycle theory, it might help out a little bit. But basically, if you're an entrepreneur, you need to know whether to make the hot dogs or make the machine that makes the hot dogs. And so you have to then allocate resources not only across products but over time. So how do you get a signal that says, I need to make the machine instead of the hot dog because people are trying to save now and they're going to want to buy hot dogs in the future? And the answer is the interest rate. When interest rates are low, I'm knowing that people are saving, and so I should start making the machines that make hot dogs. If the interest rates are high, I say, okay, these characters aren't saving very much, I should make the hot dogs now. The problem that Hayek saw was that central banks come in and by increasing and decreasing the money supply affect the supply of loanable funds and therefore affect the interest rates. And so what you get is either the wrong signal or you don't know what the signal is. And if you get the wrong signal, then you do things like you build lots of houses for which there's really no demand. Not that that might happen, but if you... And so what Hayek said was, you know, the way to solve this problem is to not have the central banks have money, but rather have private currencies. And so that's what we're going to look at today. I'm sure he would be very interested in the Bitcoins and the other private currencies that are taking place here. And historically, we find that there's been private currencies for a long time. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to start out with introducing Garrick Hileman. Garrick is an expert on Bitcoins and other currencies, and in fact, I read his paper, and it's a very nice paper. He makes regular appearances on television, and he writes for numerous publications. He's the founder of Macro Digest, which looks at economic news, analysis, and debate. Before returning to academia, Garrick worked for more than 15 years in the private sector in both equity research and corporate finance, which is, I can tell you, if you go out into the real world and come back to the classroom, it really makes a difference. Currently, he's teaching at the London School of Economics and finished his PhD in economic history, and he's going to be speaking on the history of alternative currencies. So with that, let's have a hand for Garrick.
Thank you, Gary. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to move a little quickly through quite a bit of material here because we only have 20 minutes, and to have a really rich discussion about Bitcoin, it's important, I think, to cover quite a bit of ground. So let's just get right started. First, it's important that we have a good basis of understanding about money and currencies. So we're going to go through some basics there, talk about alternative currencies, what those are, spend a little time talking about Bitcoin, not so much how it works, which is going to be covered a little bit later, but about the Bitcoin economy. and then talk about what history might have to say about Bitcoin's use as a currency. This is an important point here to make. Bitcoin has many potential uses, one of which is a currency. Others include being a technology platform, but this presentation is primarily focused on Bitcoin as currency or money. Okay, so let's get started. So money and currency. How many here in this room were taught in high school the answer to this question? Show of hands. Where does money come from? I saw about 2 or 3 hands go up. This is something that is incredibly important to everyone's everyday life, and yet it's not taught in high school, somehow remarkably. Now, most people think that money comes from the government, and the banknotes and the coins that are in your pocket, of course, are printed by the government or the Fed or the mint. But the vast majority of money actually comes from banks. It is private money. It's privately produced by banks and lent into existence through new loans. Over 90% of money, prior to quantitative easing at least, comes from banks. Somebody may have changed there with quantitative easing. That's a really important point, though, to understand where money basically comes from. And I would encourage all of you to actually go out and be ambassadors for further educating the population on where money comes from, that it's lent into existence. So money has 3 core functions. These are the textbook definitions. It's a medium of exchange. It solves this double coincidence of wants problem where I've got a horse, you've got a cow, we want to do business, but I don't want your cow. It's a store of value. It's something that retains its value from day to day. And it's also a unit of account, which means it's what goods and services are priced in. Those are the 3 things that money does. Money has a hierarchy. So these 3 functions are not all equal in terms of their importance to defining what money is. Many things are stores of value. A house is a store of value. Fewer things are a medium of exchange. Medium of exchange means that 2 people have to agree on what we're going to use as a store of value, at least temporarily, to trade. And at the highest point in the hierarchy is the unit of account. This is a medium exchange that's used across time and place between several people, and therefore it represents a coordination across society. This is a really important point here about the unit of account function of money. Economists believe generally that this function of money is its most important function, therefore. And this is kind of a visual depiction of the hierarchy of money. Many things can be a store of value, fewer are a medium of exchange, and very, very few things become a unit of account, the thing in which goods and services are priced in, and more importantly, perhaps even, how we even think about money. So we don't think in terms of Bitcoin prices today. Not that many things are priced in Bitcoins. We think in terms of dollars and euros and pounds. And we hate doing currency conversions when we travel abroad. I don't know if you're like me. It's really annoying. So there's an issue there we'll come back to a little bit later. So money and currency, is there a difference? In my paper, I spent a lot of time talking about this. I would suggest, and this is argumentative, but I would suggest that we should distinguish between money and currency. Money has all 3 of those functions, including the unit of account. So all money is also currency, but I would say that not all currency is money. Currency could be just a medium of exchange, but not a unit of account. You and I may set up a temporary medium of exchange, but it's not widely accepted, and therefore it should not be thought of as money. It should be thought of as just a currency. And under that definition, we can answer our question that often comes up. Is Bitcoin money? No. It's a currency. It's not money, though, because it's not a widely used unit of account across time and space yet. So in my paper, I defined 5 different currency types. There's really 2 kind of overarching categories. You have your legal tenders, so things like national dollars, like the US dollar. You have adopted currencies, so Ecuador and Panama actually use the US dollar, for example, as their national currency. It's been adopted, and it's legal to do that. You have parallel currencies, so prior to the introduction of the euro, countries like Portugal, Italy, other Eurozone members, they ran their national currencies, the lira, the escudo, alongside the euro in parallel. These are all examples of legal tender currencies, currencies which can be used to settle debts, to pay taxes with. There are 2 types of non-legal tender currencies: black market currencies, those that are illegal, and interestingly, a currency like the US dollar, which is legal in the United States, is illegal in a place like Argentina, so it can actually wear 2 hats at the same time. And then you have alternative currencies, which is what we're here to talk about today. So what is an alternative currency? So when I first started doing research in this space, I was hit with an alphabet soup of terms to describe alternative currencies, and here's just a few of them. Local currency, complementary currency, parallel currency is also used with alternative currency, black market, commodity, script, token currencies, digital currencies, virtual currencies, cryptocurrencies. You've got regulators today which are calling Bitcoin here in the United States a virtual currency. That's the term used by the Treasury, by the New York Department of Financial Services. Over in England, where I teach, digital currency is the term that's used for, by the Bank of England. Yet a lot of money is actually digital. So this is all very confusing. I spent a lot of time in the paper actually trying to sort out the definitions and terms, and I propose a framework for how we should define this. But first, what is an alternative currency? My definition is that it's any instrument which legally operates, so it's legal to use, as a medium of exchange, but is not minted by the central government or officially recognized as legal tender. That's my definition. And if we look at the different types of alternative currencies, and again, I cover this in the paper, there are two types. There are digital and there are tangible. First, let's talk about the tangible ones. Come in two forms. Ones that have intrinsic utility. They're useful in and of themselves. The cigarette you can see I have up there as an example of both a historical and a contemporary. I don't know if any of you watch Orange is the New Black. The cigarette is probably one of the more durable alternative currencies throughout history. It was used in POW camps in Berlin after World War II. It's used today. SIM cards with airtime minutes are actually used as currency in parts of Africa. Those are things that have usefulness in and of their own right. Metals, of course, if we go further back, could be thought of as an intrinsic currency, things that are commodity money. Tokens are more conceptual. They rely on social agreements. So, in the UK, there were merchant tokens from the 16th through 18th century that were used by merchants who were dealing with this problem called the big problem of small change. It was very expensive to mint lots of currency, small denomination currency, and so merchants started issuing their own currencies. Today, you have currencies like in Massachusetts, the Berkshires. You may be familiar with that. In London, the Brixton Pound. These are little local currencies that communities have gotten together to issue to really try to keep commerce local and also attack concerns about the globalization and the environment and whatnot. So on the digital side, which we're going to talk mostly about today, you've got these different currency types. And you can really think about them across this matrix here of centralized and decentralized digital currencies that are operating in either a closed or an open system. So the classic kind of modern closed centralized digital currency is from Second Life, this virtual reality world, which was very widely talked about a decade ago. The Linden dollar was printed by a central organization, Linden Labs, and it operated inside a closed environment, inside the Second Life virtual reality world. About 15 years ago, there were a number of startups in Silicon Valley launching digital currencies like flues and beans. Does anyone remember those? Yeah, the VCs who are backing Bitcoin today don't like to talk about flues and beans. We'll talk more about why in a minute. But those were open. You could use them at a variety of places. They weren't bounded, but they still had a central issuer. Bitcoin is arguably the first open and decentralized digital currency, meaning that it can be pretty much used anywhere, and there is no central point of issuance, no single node that can be shut down. We'll go over that in more detail in the next presentations. So looking at the 500 years of history of alternative currencies, and I think the history goes back even further still, there's some common themes that actually pop up in terms of why these things tend to proliferate over time. And all 7 of these themes I've found historical precedent for, except the one at the top, environmentalism. That's a relatively new theme that seems to be driving a lot of alternative currency growth. But improvements in technology, localism, even during the Great Depression, there were concerns about out-of-town retailers. That was a big part of why so many script currencies were introduced in the 1930s. Concerns about inefficiency, financial repression, which is capital controls, restrictions on the financial system, and then the political economy category is a bit of a catch-all, things for everything from high levels of debt to unemployment concerns, et cetera. Those are the forces which are driving interest in alternative currencies. Okay, so Bitcoin. So I'm going to focus mostly kind of on the high-level overview of the Bitcoin economy and kind of what's going on here. Why are we talking about Bitcoin? It's a good question. Why are we even talking about Bitcoin to begin with? I think there's three big reasons we're talking about Bitcoin. So first, Bitcoin is unquestionably innovative, as we'll hear more about later. There's a real innovation which took place here. Second, I don't know of any other asset class in history that had as big an annual appreciation as Bitcoin did in 2013, up 56x. Okay? The media loves this story. My first invitation to come on television was, the proverbial has the bubble burst after the Cyprus incident last year, and the price collapsed. But the media is fascinated by this price story. Tulips went up, I think, 26x, just to put this in comparison, in Holland. So big run up in price. And finally, reason number three is this guy, the inventor, or person or woman, we don't know who this is, as we'll probably hear more about. Not only did this person demonstrate a real genius for cryptography and software development, but this person was a genius at marketing, because Satoshi has managed to, the inventor of Bitcoin, has managed to keep his, her, whoever this is, their identity completely secret. And so there's a mystery here at the heart of Bitcoin. Who is the founder? And this has captivated the media's attention. All three of these things have. The media is how we come to know things, right? That's why we're talking about Bitcoin. And those are the three big reasons. It's innovative, the price, and the mystery at the heart of the creation of Bitcoin. So Bitcoin, there's a lot of drama also surrounding Bitcoin too. A lot of bad news, various people arrested, black markets, all this exotic trade going on. But it's not all bad news. You've got Ben Bernanke famously in autumn of last year coming out and saying that Bitcoin may hold promise. A-list entrepreneurs like Richard Branson agreeing to accept it. It's being used in places like Argentina to achieve social objectives with farming. So mix of bad and good news, but the media has really latched onto this. That's why we're talking about Bitcoin. It's really captured the zeitgeist. I've got a trio of Harvardians here. I don't know if that's a word or not, including my thesis advisor, Neil Ferguson, who I convinced that he initially thought Bitcoin was just a speculative object, but he's said some more positive things, I think, more recently. But others like Ken Rogoff, it's not a currency, it's not going to become one. Still a lot of skeptics, in the public intellectual space, but they're talking about Bitcoin. It's really captured people's imaginations. So the venture capital community thinks that Bitcoin's as big as the PC or the internet. Mark Andreessen wrote a really interesting piece in the New York Times earlier this year making this argument. He thinks Bitcoin today is at where the internet was in 1993 and the PC was in 1975. And if you look at the amount of money they're investing, the VCs are, in Bitcoin startups, it's pretty significant, $375 million of publicly disclosed money to date. So the real number is probably well north of $400 million. And if you compare that to what they were investing in the internet back in 1995, which is the earliest year we have data, they put $250 million into internet startups in 1995. This is not an inflation-adjusted number. There are all sorts of other adjustments you might want to make to do a true apples-to-apples comparison, such as the lowering cost of launching a startup, et cetera, et cetera. But it's still interesting that in 2014, this year that Mark compares to 1993, we're projecting to well exceed what was invested in the internet in Bitcoin startups. So the VCs are walking the talk. This is a big deal. There's all sorts of things that potentially Bitcoin could disrupt in terms of the financial services system: payment processing, deposit fees, withdrawal and overdraft fees, foreign exchange fees, float charges, transfer wire fees, title insurance, copyright registration. This is getting more into kind of the other uses of Bitcoin beyond currency. You could use Bitcoin as a notary service, escrow, collections. So big opportunities here. This is a depiction of the Bitcoin economy in terms of the companies that are operating in the Bitcoin space. There's 6 different kind of categories of companies. You've got wallets. This is where you store your Bitcoin. You've got exchanges where you can go to buy them. You've got payment processors. These are the companies that plug into some of the retailers which are accepting Bitcoin to make it easy for those retailers to avoid any Forex risk, to accept Bitcoin but then instantly convert into dollars. And they pay these processors a fee sometimes for that. There's mining companies. We'll talk next presentation more about mining, but these are the companies that are producing the hardware which runs the Bitcoin network. And then there's a catch-all group called financial services for everything from Bitcoin ATMs to Bitcoin gift cards to news organizations. But in the center there, I have a category called universal. And those of you who are familiar with the banking system might recognize this term. The universal Bitcoin companies are the ones that are kind of looking to operate in multiple kind of parts of the value chain here. They're providing exchange services, wallet, financial services, et cetera. They're leveraging two kind of key deficiencies right now with Bitcoin in any financial services system, which is trust. So if I trust you as a wallet, I'm more likely to trust you as an exchange, and also efficiency. Same thing we see with banking, right? And the universals are collecting, more money than most. They have about 22% of the total VC investment that's gone into this ecosystem to date. But you see that it's roughly well balanced across the different 6 sectors in terms of where the money's going. There's about 6 million Bitcoin wallets today, so that's an approximate size for how many people are actually using Bitcoin, although there's no restriction on you having multiple wallets. So that's, take that with a grain of salt. And that's not even a complete estimate, but we know there's roughly about that. And I'm projecting about 8 million by the end of the year. So that's kind of the growth trajectory. Over 75,000 merchants, which are currently accepting Bitcoin, including some big names. Dell, not long ago, announced they're accepting Bitcoin. They do about $60 billion in revenue a year. They're actually offering 10% off Alienware products. So if your little one is a gamer and you want to save a little money, send them to Dell's site. Michael Dell can pay me a little later for that little free plug, right? But a lot of big merchants are getting behind this. There's a PR benefit to saying you accept Bitcoin. The news media covers that. And some companies are actually doing significant revenues. Overstock, I think, is projecting they're going to do about $1 million a month by the end of this year. So commerce is starting to take off. Still very small, though. So let's talk about price, though, because that's what's in the news. Bitcoin's price has been plummeting since the beginning of the year. It rallied a little bit in the second quarter, but then it dropped about 40% in the last quarter, and then dropped further still. What's going on with that? Well, there's a lot of people who have a lot of reasons, or, a lot of ideas about what's going on with price. Some of the early adopters are selling. There's a general correction in technology equities, strong U.S. dollar, concerns about what's called a 51% attack, which we'll get into, I'm sure, later, global instability, competition from Apple Pay, et cetera. I think the real reason the price has been suffering is related to this chart here. So Bitcoin, to earn Bitcoins, you have to process you have to compute a puzzle, basically, with your computer. You and I can go download the Bitcoin software and start mining new Bitcoins, or try to. But that's getting harder and harder. So there's an arms race going on, basically, and the people who are mining Bitcoins have to spend more and more money on new, faster computers to do it. And those computers have to be paid for, along with the electricity to run them, sometimes with something other than Bitcoin. So some of the new Bitcoins that are coming on market have to be sold into the marketplace, and that's what's driving, I think, the price down. Okay, so let's quickly go through this new piece of research I'm working on called the Bitcoin Market Potential Index. This is a index which is meant to answer the question of where Bitcoin might get traction, what factors might drive growth in Bitcoin. First, I'll give you the rankings. These are the top 10 countries where Bitcoin has the most potential utility. Argentina is number 1. Basically, things like, how big is the international remittances market? What's the level of technology penetration? How much Bitcoin penetration is? How many people are using the software? Are kind of the positive index drivers. The more negative index drivers are how much inflation is in the country, financial repression, what's the history of financial crises? How big is the black market? Those things drive the rankings. And you can see Latin America in general is number 1. They've got 40% of the top 10 countries and about 27% of the top 30, followed by Africa and the post-Soviet areas. So important for us here in the first world to understand that Bitcoin as a currency has, I think, much greater utility outside of places like the United States, which has, for all its warts and all, a reasonably stable currency and a reasonably well-run financial system relative to the rest of the world. So Bitcoin could help people potentially leapfrog credit cards and bank accounts in the same way that people in Africa kind of, leapfrogged landlines and went right to mobile phones. Those are prepaid. You don't need a credit history to get a mobile phone. You just bring in your cash. Same thing with bank accounts. You had to have a history there. So this is an opportunity. If you want to see an interactive heat map of the Market Potential Index, you can go to bitcoiniq.info. Okay, I've got to move here really quickly through the rest of this here. So what can history tell us about Bitcoin? Well, we know who won the last battle in trying to make money more plentiful versus more scarce. In the late 19th century, in the duel, the battle over the gold standard and adding silver, New York won. They beat the farmers out west and William Jennings Bryan, and gold remained the standard. Silver was not added. You can see a similar battle playing out here today with the bankers in New York. Jamie Dimon and others, not a big fan of this. Silicon Valley out west, pushing for money to become more plentiful. We'll see who wins this time, but history is not necessarily all that encouraging. 3 ways in which alternative currencies die, primarily. They die a quick death, by the way. That's the big headline for my research. They don't last very long, by and large. Regulation is not a leading cause, but it has happened. The free geld and the Great Depression was outlawed by the Australian Central Bank. Bitcoin hasn't been banned in that many places yet, though, so I don't think regulation right now is a big risk to Bitcoin. But you are seeing companies move from, say, New York to London in response to U.S. regulatory pressure. Another leading cause of alternative currency death is technology. I think this is a much bigger threat to Bitcoin, and Bitcoin's quite ironic. It's trying to do away with paper money and banks, but at the same time, the safest way to secure your Bitcoins is to actually print them out on a paper wallet, as it's called, and actually keep it in a safe deposit box. We don't have time to cover that. We'll cover it, I'm sure, later. The biggest cause for alternative currency death is simply lack of adoption. These things just cease to be desired. That kills, by and large, almost all of these things. Why would something not get adopted? Well, charts like this. This is one of the early charts used to explain what Bitcoin is. Try showing this to your average person in the street, and their eyes are going to glaze over. Social movements are very hard to maintain. There's very much a movement around Bitcoin. Can that be sustained? They don't always last very long. And we've tried this before. VCs have invested hundreds of millions in these previous digital currencies, and they didn't work. There's also a very highly concentrated ownership structure of Bitcoin. About half the Bitcoins are held by just 1,000 people. So very, very tightly controlled currency supply. So final thoughts, real quick. Very hard to forecast where Bitcoin's going. It sits at this complex intersection between technology, policy, and economics. These things are constantly changing and shifting. Bitcoin's fate is really linked to the global financial stability or instability as well. I mean, how successful are the world central banks going to be at continuing to hold hands as they do and jump off the cliff together and keeping the whole ship afloat? That's going to have an impact on Bitcoin's future. We'll just skip through these. It's not unreasonable for me, though, to imagine a day like Barry Eichengreen does when the U.S. dollar is no longer going to be the dominant reserve currency and there's a rebalancing. And should there be enough global instability, something like Bitcoin being introduced as a new, as part of a new basket of reserve currencies, say as a recalibrating of the IMF special drawing rights. I think that is conceivable, especially if things go badly. The more optimistic view about Bitcoin is that we're, looking at the technology hype cycle, we're down here in the trough. A more pessimistic view about Bitcoin as a currency is that how can it ever become money if it's volatile? And without a central bank standing behind it to set a ceiling and a floor on the value, the exchange rate of Bitcoin, it's always going to be more volatile than a well-run national currency that has a central bank with unlimited firepower, effectively, to back that currency. That's going to be a really hard hurdle for Bitcoin to clear in terms of becoming a unit of account. So that's all. Thank you for giving me a little extra time.
All right, so we're 1/3 of the way of knowing more than anybody else in this. Sam Patterson will be next, and he's the senior policy analyst at the Koch Institute. He's the author of one of the first books on explaining how Bitcoins work, called Bitcoin Beginner. He's written for several pro-liberty organizations on Bitcoins, and he's involved in open source projects, which I told him I wasn't quite sure what that meant this morning, that aim to decentralize the existing networks in order to give individuals more liberty and more freedom over what they do and how to control their own money and trade. You can read his articles at cronychronicles.org. So with that, Sam Patterson.
Thank you very much. So, let's see. Whoops. get my slides up here. Do we have these?
See, that's what happens. This is what happens when you rely on technology. You know, I just use a blackboard and white chalk. I'm good to go.
So this is a technically complex subject. So teaching, trying to explain it in 20 minutes is like drinking from a fire hose, okay? So you may not get everything I'm going to go through here, and that's okay. The goal is just to learn more about it and to get a general sort of overview of how it works technically. So before I go into the technical details and we get the slide up, I'm going to give you a story about a way to think about Bitcoin, which is meant to be non-technical. So, and if you guys don't have the slideshow, I have it on the USB drive here, if that would help. Always carry a USB backup. Okay, so a group of 12 islanders on a remote island in the middle of Pacific. All right, there's a group of these guys out in the middle of nowhere. They deeply distrust each other, each blaming the other for the boating accident that left them stranded here months ago. They all decide to live on separate parts of the island, but soon discover that they need the skills and work of others to survive and thrive. Over the months, a form of currency arises on the island, cowrie shells, which cannot be faked. These were historically used as a currency a long time ago. And they begin trading with each other until one accuses the other of stealing, some of these shells during a trade. The villagers talk about creating a bank to hold the shells for them, but no one trusts anyone else to run that bank. So they decide to arrange a system that will prevent theft without a bank. They make a small clearing in the middle of the island and place 12 unbreakable glass boxes in the clearing, each with the individual's name on it. They have a slit at the top where you can deposit shells into, but they cannot be opened without a key, which each villager has to their own box. They all deposit their shells into their boxes, record the number of shells in everyone else's boxes and their own, and they review the numbers with each other to make sure everyone agrees. Now, the villagers engage in trade by visiting the clearing, taking shells from their own box, and depositing it in another villager's box. They then change the numbers in a public ledger, which is posted in the middle of the clearing, and everyone can see the number of shells in the boxes, and all parties can review this public ledger to make sure that it is accurate. Years pass. The next generation of islanders has added more boxes as the village grew. One young, bright villager was watching the active trade in the clearing one day and came to the realization that the public ledger itself was representing the trade because the shells had no real value. And as long as the villagers agreed to the changes in the ledger, the boxes and shells didn't need to exist. But the villagers were still mistrustful of each other, so they determined that using unforgeable signatures at the time of the transaction, they could actually all meet at the end of the day and update this public ledger in the clearing together. If someone had tried to cheat someone during the day, this fraud would be exposed in the reckoning of the ledger at night. Many generations later, the island became technologically advanced with networked computers. An enterprising young villager realized that instead of maintaining this massive public ledger in the clearing and updating it every night, it could be made digital, distributed to all the villagers on their computers, and updated over the network in real time. As soon as the ledger changed between two villagers, there was a transaction, everyone knew what the trade was, and because they had a history of all the transactions in this ledger, they could verify if those amounts were accurate. As you may have guessed, this is basically Bitcoin. It's a distributed public ledger that allows for trading digital currency with another party without needing to trust them, because the entire network is verifying that new transactions are valid continuously. Okay, that's the non-technical explanation. So what is Bitcoin? I know there's a rule you're not supposed to read from your slides. I'm going to make an exception for the abstract of my paper. I'm going to talk through this here. So Bitcoin is a technological and monetary innovation that allows for peer-to-peer transfer of value without trusting third parties. The system uses a distributed public ledger to reach consensus among network participants, the users of the currency, about the legitimacy of transactions. The ledger is not denominated with fiat currencies, but instead uses its own units called bitcoins. The system relies on various elements of cryptography, which is basically fancy math, to ensure that this public ledger is accurate instead of relying on a central institution. The code is open source, which basically means everyone can look at it, review it, and contribute to it. And the network is decentralized, resulting in low barriers to entry and censorship resistance. Anyone can join the network and use it, and it's very difficult, essentially impossible, to shut down from an outside party, because it's just people running the programs on their computers all over the world. New bitcoins are issued by a predictable algorithm that is intended to replicate the mining of a scarce resource. I'll talk about that in a minute. Okay, so what is Bitcoin really? Okay, it's actually two things, Bitcoin and bitcoins. Bitcoin, uppercase, singular, is a network for this trade that we talked about. Bitcoins are the digital currency that this network uses. Okay, most people talk about bitcoins as a digital currency, and Garrick did an excellent job of doing so, but it's actually the network where the innovation takes place. And this is because it solves the double spending problem. So bitcoins are not the first digital currency. Right? We had previous ones, but they were all centralized to avoid double spending. Double spending is what it sounds like. If you have a digital currency, how can you be sure that your digital representation of value hasn't been duplicated and spent elsewhere? It's very easy to copy a file, right? You can send the same piece of data 100 times. In the past, they solved this by having a central institution that maintained that ledger. Okay? If you sent 10 units of the digital currency from your account to someone else, this company would take, the central institution would take 10 out of yours, put 10 into theirs. It equaled to 0 at the end of the day. That's how they solved the double spending problem. Bitcoin solves the double spending problem without relying on a central institution, because the ledger of transactions is public and distributed to all participants, and there are cryptographic rules that ensure it must be legitimate moving forward. So the distributed ledger, which is called the blockchain, I'll talk about that in a minute, contains the history of every transaction which has ever occurred on the network, allowing any participant to know the exact ledger balances at any moment, and, importantly, verify if proposed transactions are legitimate. If someone tries to double spend, the network will look at it and say, wait a minute, that Bitcoin was already here and it's gone here. This is an invalid transaction. It will be rejected. Bitcoin's based on cryptography, okay, which is just a way of saying using math to secure communications and identities. The network and the currency aren't managed by rule of law or by rule of man, but are ruled by math, which is a unique way to have a currency. It uses public key cryptography for the digital signatures and cryptographic hashing for proof of work. I know you probably aren't familiar with those terms. I'll go through those quickly. Public key cryptography uses a key pair for secure communication and identity. A key pair is a public key, which is a random string of letters and numbers, and a private key, which is a random string of letters and numbers that corresponds to the public key. They're linked. So what you need to know is, this is Bob trying to send a message to Alice. Alice has a key pair, a public key and a private key. Everyone can see her public key, and Bob takes the message, hello Alice, encrypts it, which just means use math in a fancy way, with Alice's public key. It's sent to Alice. Only she is able to decrypt it with her private key and read that message. This also works for signatures. If Alice were to sign a message with her private key, then people can verify by looking at the public key that this was actually her that signed it. That's how digital signatures work. So how it's used in Bitcoin is, we talked about this distributed ledger, right? This history of transactions, which everyone can look at. And the Bitcoins are in this ledger, right? But how is ownership defined? of entries in this ledger, right? How is ownership of Bitcoin defined? Well, the public key in this pair is used to create a Bitcoin address where the funds reside. Everyone can see this address in the network. It's made with a public key. But the private key, which only the individual has, controls the funds themselves. They actually have access to the transaction. So it uses public key cryptography to verify this, basically. So in order for network participants, which are commonly referred to as nodes, to determine that a user is legitimately in control over a certain entry in the public ledger over a certain portion of Bitcoins, the node which initiates a transaction when they try to send money will sign a message with their private key stating they want to send Bitcoins from their public address to another public address, and that is broadcast to the network. So once this message is distributed, other nodes verify that the signature matches the public key of the address. If it's valid, if it does match up, then it's put into a queue, essentially, of transactions called a block, which I'll talk about in a second. If it's not valid, it's rejected, and it never makes it into the block. So a block contains all the transactions that have been proposed on this network, essentially, since the last block was added. And new blocks are added about every 10 minutes. Added to what? Okay, added to the blockchain, added to the public record of transactions. So the blockchain is a chronological chain of blocks, hence the name, that extends backward to the first transaction on the network back in January 2009 by Satoshi Nakamoto, the individual who created this currency. And importantly, every user has the same blockchain to check against. They all have the identical public ledger, the blockchain, to make sure new transactions are valid. Right now, there's about 326,000 blocks that have been created so far. How are these created? Well, there's cryptographic rules about how new blocks are created and added to this blockchain. If not for these rules, it would be difficult for network participants, users of the currency, to agree to a shared version of the blockchain. Right? If someone's adding something to the blockchain one way and someone's doing it a different way, those blockchains are now different, and you cannot use it as a shared ledger for exchanging currency. So you use something called proof of work. Proof of work basically just means creating a block is difficult. It takes a lot of time to do, as I said, approximately 10 minutes. And this is done by cryptographic hashing. I'm not going to go into the details of that. It basically just means you take an arbitrary piece of data, you put it through an algorithm that changes it and puts out another arbitrary piece of data. So what happens is, in order for a node to broadcast a block, right, they've collected all the transactions, they want to push this block into the blockchain, into this permanent record. They must broadcast proof that they did an extensive hashing necessary, a lot of work, to find the solution to an arbitrary puzzle. All these nodes are attempting to add a block to the blockchain simultaneously by hashing SHA-256, that's just an algorithm, and search for an output that begins with a certain number of zeros. It just means you're finding a puzzle to a problem, an answer to a puzzle. So the first node to find that answer, which is random, broadcasts that block along with the answer to all the other nodes, and if it's accurate, it's added to that blockchain. The difficulty of this adjusts automatically. If you have more people on the network, it's harder to find the answer, but it still takes about 10 minutes. And the node which solves the puzzle is rewarded with Bitcoins. Right now, the block reward is about 25 Bitcoins for finding one of these blocks and adding it to the blockchain. It used to be 50. Every 4 years, it goes in half. So in 2 years from now, it'll be 12 and a half, et cetera, until eventually we reach a limit of 21 million Bitcoins that will ever be mined. So there is actually a cap to the money supply in Bitcoin. It can never exceed 21 million. The network itself is reliant on code, which is open source and decentralized. As I mentioned, open source just means everyone can look at it, everyone can review it, everyone can propose changes. That means it has low barriers to entry and censorship resistance, as I mentioned. The code is not stagnant. It can change with consensus. If people have an improvement to add to this digital network and currency, they can propose it, and if other people agree to it, then it becomes de facto. The network size is unknown. There are at least hundreds of thousands of users. You heard 8 million wallets earlier. There's probably not 8 million users because you can use more than one wallet. But we don't know how many users there are. Bitcoin improvement protocols, proposals are additions to the existing code, some are adopted and some aren't. And there's some notable ones that I'll go through really quickly. Multi-signature is just really fascinating. It's a way to use currency that just has not existed before. Basically, instead of one person owning this private key and having access to these bitcoins, you break that up. And multiple people have sort of joint ownership. And a certain portion of those people have to agree before a transaction can happen. The most popular one right now is called 2 of 3 multi-signature, which means 2 of 3 people must both digitally sign a transaction before it'll be legitimate in the record. This allows for things like escrow, where you have a buyer, a seller, and an arbiter or someone in escrow, and 2 of those 3 people must agree before the transaction happens. That will prevent scamming online, right? The buyer and seller will have to agree for the 2 of 3, or if one's trying to scam the other, the third party and the buyer or the third party and the seller will agree to change where the Bitcoin end up. Hierarchical deterministic wallets, this is just a way of saying instead of having a new private key pair for each of these Bitcoin addresses, you have one master key pair that allows you to create a whole bunch of new ones using the same key. Passwords for private keys and merchant protocols, there's a lot of these. So wallets themselves are how you store the Bitcoin. So the private key, as I mentioned, is essentially ownership over the Bitcoin in themselves. Without the private key, you cannot access the funds in this blockchain. So owning a Bitcoin means owning the private key. Wallets store private keys. Some are more secure, some are more convenient. I have a wallet on my smartphone, not particularly secure, but it's very convenient. But all of them have different features, but there's some core functionality of wallets, how they work. One is that they hold users' private keys, naturally. One is that they sign and broadcast transactions with the private key, that's actually being able to send the Bitcoin. And the last is that they monitor the blockchain to keep funds updated. If there's transactions coming to you, you want to be able to see that naturally. So those are the core functions of wallets. Altcoins would take too much time to explain. So basically just avoid them, essentially. What they are is a Bitcoin clone with small adjustments to the code for the most part. People take the Bitcoin code, they change a few lines here, they re-release it with a new name. Sometimes it's just a joke, sometimes it's a scam. So I wouldn't get involved with them, basically. But it is important to note that blockchains aren't only good for transferring digital currency. They can do all kinds of stuff. One's called Namecoin. That allows for a distributed identity system. Instead of relying on the existing identity systems, you can have it in a blockchain. And also, Bitcoin itself is not only used to transfer digital currency. The Bitcoin blockchain can be used as an asset register. You can basically take a small amount of Bitcoin, say, this represents the deed to a house, or this represents a share in X company. And when you transfer that Bitcoin, because it's all in the public ledger, you're essentially transferring ownership. It's pretty fascinating stuff. Okay, so in conclusion there, Bitcoin's a distributed public ledger for transferring digital currency without trusting in third parties. It has a large and growing network. And this is probably why so many people in the liberty movement, if you want to call it that, people who are supportive of free markets are excited. It's reliant on math instead of reliant on central banks, instead of being reliant on traditional banks or on payment processors or on the government agencies which regulate and control these industries so tightly and prevent innovation from occurring. Thank you.
Well, now we know 2/3 more than anybody else. Now I'd like to introduce our last speaker, George Selgin. Excuse me, George is professor of economics emeritus at the University of Georgia, and he's now director of, I think it's a new institute, is that right? Yeah, the new center, Cato's Institute Center for Monetary and Financial Alternatives. He's author of several books. He's well known in the history of money and monetary theory, including Good Money, Birmingham Button Makers, the Royal Mint, and the Beginnings of Modern Coinage, which was published in 2008. He's also editor of, or co-editor of Economic Journal Watch, which is an electronic journal. I've looked at it several times myself. devoted to exposing, quote, inappropriate assumptions, weak chains of argument, phony claims of relevance, and omissions of pertinent truths in the writings of professional economists, which means it's a very thick journal. With that, I'd like to introduce George Selgin.
Thank you all. Thanks, Gary. Anita asked me to give a talk on Bitcoin. She did that, and originally asked me to give a talk about the problems of Bitcoin. But I personally think Bitcoin's a wonderful thing, although I admit it in part that's because it's now not possible for people to claim that monetary economics is the most needlessly obscure and impenetrable subject on the planet. But in fact, I really did want to say some positive things as well as pointing out some problems about Bitcoin, and that's what I'm going to do today. As Sam's talk made clear, and Sam really did do a good job reducing some of that impenetrability I referred to, Bitcoins are digital medium. They're not actual coins, so you must get out of your minds this image of a metallic disk, although there are such things out there that are actually, I think, a form of Bitcoin wallet more than anything else. I'm relieved not to have to summarize how Bitcoin works, although I was going to do so using that chart, which actually I found the chart impossible myself and put it up for the same reason. So let's start out with the first problem about Bitcoin, which is one that Garrick, I think, already presented to us, which is the simple fact that by most definitions they aren't money. Garrick emphasized the unit of account. I tend to emphasize the medium of exchange function. It's really not important, frankly, which one you put emphasis on. Whatever becomes a widely accepted medium of exchange will tend, for that reason, to be adopted as well as the basis for the unit of account. It's simply more convenient that way. You charge people in prices that are in terms of what you expect to get paid. Now, we all know that Federal Reserve dollars, as much as we may not like them, or at least the way they're managed, are money because you can use them for pretty much any purchase in the country and plenty of purchases outside for that matter. Now, Carl Menger explains to us how it is that something can become a generally accepted medium of exchange, but Menger, by that, and that's money, Menger emphasizes this widespread or general acceptability is the real key. We've seen that Bitcoin is accepted in trade. I'll talk a little bit more about that, but it certainly doesn't qualify as generally accepted. Menger also has a theory about how things become generally accepted in exchange. And this theory, too, suggests a problem with Bitcoin. It's not only that it isn't a widely accepted medium of exchange, but according to the most Menger's theory, it should never be possible for it to become a medium of exchange at all. Menger's theory suggests that money grows out of barter, and it starts out with people trying to figure out how can they barter more effectively by trading what they have for something that may be a little bit easier to fob off for what they want. Well, as people start trying to do this, of course, they start focusing on certain goods to trade for, which they can, they hope, trade again for other goods they really want. So you get a kind of a horse race going, and eventually certain goods seem to be more successful as media of exchange. One or two, and eventually perhaps only one, become generally adopted for that purpose, at which point you have no longer got barter, you've got money. The problem is, though, that according to conventional wisdom, nobody's going to think to trade what they have for something that no one wants in order to try to trade that again. They're going to look for things that already have trade value for non-monetary reasons, things that have valued as jewelry, for example, or ornament, as cowrie shells ware, for example, and as, of course, the precious metals where nobody wants digits until they can figure out something to do with the digits. and otherwise you just have play money. Now, once you get people using, enough people using something as a medium of exchange, more and more other people want to use it for that reason. So if you can just get this bandwagon going, it tends to be self-reinforcing. But that, too, is a problem for any innovative new would-be currency, because when you have already a fully an established, generally accepted medium of exchange, a bandwagon that everybody's pretty much on, who wants to jump on another empty bandwagon? So Bitcoin not only isn't really money, it shouldn't be possible for it to become money. But there's a prospect, because in fact, despite the theory, Bitcoins have gotten a foothold as exchange media. It's interesting why they should have done so, given what I just said, and they're gaining ground. So let's talk about that. It started out just as a bunch of computer geeks playing around. I doubt that this Japanese fellow ever really existed. I suspect it was a bunch of people who looked about as Japanese as these guys. One of them looks a little bit like Sam. And they were just playing around, right? But eventually, this little toy they were playing around with, this play money, if you like, started to be perceived as something that had some virtues as exchange outside of the little network of players that started out doing this. And the next thing you know, people are finding it useful for, well, certain kinds of transactions. But of course, the whole point of Menger's theory is that if something gets adopted at all as an exchange medium, it becomes more attractive for others to adopt it, and that seems to be what has happened. Having gained a foothold, surprisingly, Bitcoin has managed to prosper since then, and now, of course, we have even large, important firms accepting Bitcoin, and the figure was mentioned by Garrick that there are now some 75,000 merchants, I assume that's just in the U.S., who accept it. I remember about 3 years ago pointing out that there were 1,000 and saying, I bet you there's 10 times as many in a year, and then sure enough it was 10,000, and that was 2 years ago or so, and here we are at 75,000. Well, you can see what the trend is. In principle, this could go very far. We don't know, of course, how far it'll go. So, yes, Bitcoins could conceivably become money. They could. And they've gotten further than many would have ever expected they could do. But there's a problem. If Bitcoins were to become money, that is, if they were to become a widely accepted medium of exchange, and even more importantly, if they were to actually displace dollars, and we're just using Bitcoin. So now we've got a Bitcoin economy. We've got prices expressed in Bitcoin. We don't have to worry about the Fed. We've got a Bitcoin supply, and that's controlled. Well, it's not controlled at all. It's predetermined. That's got its advantages and its disadvantages. One of the obvious disadvantages is, again, something that was referred to by Garrick, is that the price bounces around all the time. Now, of course, here we're looking at the exchange rate in terms of dollars. What we would care about in a Bitcoin economy is the overall stability of the purchasing power of Bitcoins. But if the present stability or instability in terms of dollars is any guide, this stuff could bounce around a lot more than dollars themselves, and could even lose value over time, perhaps more rapidly than dollars, if recent experience is to be our guide. Now, of course, once Bitcoin's widely accepted, we should realize that there will be an element of stability to the demand for it that's simply not present now, since it's not yet money. And so it's a mistake to assume that the stability of Bitcoin as money would mirror or resemble the stability or instability that it has today as an aspiring money. So let's not overestimate or overstate the potential instability of a Bitcoin medium of exchange. But there's another problem, which is a longer-term problem, and it has to do with the algorithm that determines the quantity of Bitcoin output over time. The algorithm essentially raises mining costs regardless of what mining technology and effort is going on, so that the total amount of bitcoins produced in any period is strictly predetermined. And it's predetermined according to a schedule, this schedule, that has it level off at 21 million coins within, another, I think something like 20 years from now, more or less than that perhaps. We've got about 13 or 14 million, something like that so far. So, in short, the total maximum quantity of Bitcoin currency, if it gets adopted as a general medium exchange or not, is absolutely fixed. There can never be more. Now let's compare that to something like the gold standard, okay? The gold standard was not a fixed quantity exchange medium. And in fact, mining of gold went on all the time in the gold standard era, as it has done since. Moreover, the amount of mining activity tended to increase with the purchasing power of gold, or with the or opposite movements in the general price level while on a gold standard. That meant that there was an automatic tendency for more gold to be mined if the purchasing power of money was growing rapidly, and that tended to stabilize that purchasing power over time. And that's why we had long-run price level stability under the gold standard, with some short-run tendency for prices to fall, corrected in the long run by new mining effort and discoveries. Bitcoin won't give us such a result. It would be expected instead to deliver much more long-run deflation than the gold standard, and perhaps levels of deflation that could be rather unpleasant. Remember that I'm not an opponent of deflation. Gradual deflation consistent with productivity growth is something I've advocated, or at least defended, at length. But here we're talking about a currency that could in the long run produce more deflation than that, and harmful deflation, because it can't keep up with the overall real demand for money as a gold standard might. Banking could help. There's no reason why you couldn't have Bitcoin-based banking. That would provide another set of substitutes for Bitcoin. But again, that gold banking systems, the gold standard had, of course, gold-based money substitutes created by banks, and yet it was still desirable that the gold supply should be able to grow and augment the base of monetary gold over time. Again, this standard wouldn't allow it. But now we come to another prospect, which is that in principle, Bitcoin technology, and now you notice I say Bitcoin rather than Bitcoins, can be used to make a distinctly superior money. Let's first step back and look at the problems of the sorts of monies that have been available to us in the past. Well, we've got fiat monies like the dollar that can be arbitrarily manipulated and are by a body of people making discretionary decisions. When they do the wrong thing, it can be very bad news indeed. Yes, the dollar is better than plenty of other fiat currencies in the world, but it's not particularly great. When you're being told that 2% inflation is just rock bottom, even though it means the value of money is cut in half every 35 years or so, that's pretty bad, and that's the best we can expect to do in the future. We could do much worse indeed. But past commodity monies, which have been the only alternative so far, they're not perfect. Gold had virtues that I've mentioned. In principle, though, you could have a major gold discovery that could disrupt the purchasing power of gold. You could have changes in non-monetary demand and so on. By the way, most critics of the gold standard who mention these things never bother to compare the actual record of such shocks to gold's purchasing power with the record of what happens under fiat money when some central banker shocks the supply of that. But never mind, the truth is that past commodity monies haven't been perfect. They are subject to the whims of nature in the same way that fiat money is subject to the whims of men. Well, here's the cool thing about Bitcoin. In principle, the same sort of people who came up with the original algorithm can come up with another one where the supply adjusts in a much more, let's say, macroeconomically friendly way. there's no reason in principle why you can't have a version of Bitcoin that preserves the desirable features of the present one. It wouldn't be Bitcoin, of course, it would be an altcoin of some sort, but where the total supply schedule not only allows for long-run growth of the supply, but also can allow for feedback in response to, say, the number of transactions and other measures of spending that could give you a relatively smooth spending schedule over time, and thus have the supply automatically adjust beyond the power of anyone to manipulate it in a macroeconomically desirable way, in a way consistent with long-run monetary stability. It's perfectly technologically possible, I'm told. So that's good news. Sometimes I talk about this being a doomsday machine, right? The thing about Bitcoin technology is you set up this algorithm and you're done. No one can ever manipulate it again. You can't turn it off. You can't change it. You're set with it. And I've heard people say, well, you know, that's terrible. What if we have a contingency? Well, if you set the thing up, you can take into account the kinds of contingencies that would really warrant some change in the supply of money. But you're not making it so that anybody can otherwise manipulate. I think that's a good thing. I think it's sometimes good to more or less lash yourself to the mast, monetarily speaking, and have a money where nobody can mess around. The virtue of the gold standard was that nobody could suddenly put some more gold in the ground, you know, and change the mining profits that way. I had to say something about him. You know, Krugman's writing, oh, Bitcoin, you know, it's just, there's no foundation for this stuff. It's just digits. For goodness sake, there's no foundation for fiat money. But at least with Bitcoin, we know there'll never be more than 21 million. How can Krugman assume that fiat dollars are therefore something we can rely on more in the long run than Bitcoin? Don't understand that argument, frankly. But alas, I end on a negative note, a problem. Cybercurrency competition, and I say this as a big fan of the general idea of currency competition, I've spent most of my career writing about it, won't necessarily favor the most stable possible currency. Now, I think in principle we want to see Bitcoin and other such currencies compete freely with established currencies, for starters. We'd like to have a level playing field so that they can have a chance to, you know, be chosen if people prefer them. We need to therefore watch out about things like taxing Bitcoin as a commodity and subjecting it therefore to capital gains and all that. It's a reasonable decision if you assume Bitcoin won't become money, but it will be prejudiced. It prejudices things against it, against its becoming so. Then, of course, we have all these other potential cyber currency rivals to Bitcoin that keep popping up, and we want them to be able to compete too. But here's the problem, and it goes back to Hayek's theory that Garrick also mentioned. Hayek assumes in denationalization of money, which really is a prescient work in light of Bitcoin. And Bitcoin comes closest to resembling what Hayek envisioned in that book when he talked about private fiat monies. He actually imagined people private firms issuing fiat monies, that is monies that didn't consist of useful commodities, but managing them so that they would maintain their value over time. Now here's the catch. Hayek assumed that competition among these different fiat currency issuers would lead to those providing the most stable currencies, and he had in mind stability of purchasing power, winning out over the others. And that sounds reasonable if you're talking to economists, because economists, of course, would say, most of them, oh, of all these currencies, here's the best one, it's the most stable. The problem is that consumers of currencies, that is, people choosing which currencies to trade with, aren't necessarily thinking in macroeconomic terms. They're not necessarily choosing something because it has the desirable property of maintaining its purchasing power over time, for example, just to stick to that criterion, which we can have issues with. There are other criteria we might macroeconomically prefer, some of us. But the problem is Hayek never really established that competition would lead to that result, and there's a very critical literature that says, for example, in the case of printing fiat money, that one problem would be in that case that it might be optimal for producers to say they're going to stabilize purchasing power and then to just print tons of this stuff and cheat their customers. In the case that we're talking about now, though, I think there's a much more fundamental problem, which is if you and I are deciding which of these cyber currencies should we try to trade with, if they're all equally tradable so far, it means making that decision means making a decision perhaps to hold this currency in your wealth portfolio for some period of time. It might not be very long. Other things being equal, what do you prefer? Having a currency in your wallet that appreciates, depreciates, or stays stable? The answer is appreciates. And so I don't think we know that people would in fact favor what economists might call a macroeconomically stable choice rather than going for what appreciates fastest as long as it's sitting in their cyber wallet. We have, therefore, no solid reason for assuming that competition among cyber currencies, Bitcoin-like currencies, would necessarily result in that currency prevailing and taking over that would be the most stable. Well, I've left on a problem. Anita will be happy. I thank you all very much for your attention.
Well, now we're almost complete. What we have to do, we have time for some questions, and there will be these two lovely ladies over here will be walking around with a microphone. So if you'd wait till you get the microphone, and if you could say who you're addressing the question to, I will let them hand the microphone to somebody and they can go. So let's have, and you know what, if you don't ask questions, we'll just start calling on people, so.
Thank you. I'd like to take up the challenge which George just posed at the end about how to make sure that the best currency wins. I'm just wondering, maybe this is a fantasy world or something like this, that the maybe how should I put it? This is real fantasy, I suppose. The Fed could adopt Bitcoin rules, or the Fed could adopt the rules. You could, in fact, you could put in a Taylor rule for the growth of currencies or something like this, and in some sense make a how should I put it? A sophisticated automation of monetary policy that would avoid whatever problems of discretion or whatever or otherwise that there might be. Is that something that fits along with the scheme of Bitcoin, or is that something that's totally different and doesn't connect to this vision? So I guess I'd address this first to George, and then maybe anybody else who wants to come in.
Yeah, thank you for that question. It does connect, and you know, we think of Hayek. I've said, and Garrick has said Hayek was rather prescient on Bitcoin, but there was another fellow who was prescient too, in a way, and that was Milton Friedman, because Friedman way back was saying that the ideal arrangement, and one he favored in the 70s, was that instead of having the Fed, you should have the money supply controlled by a computer that would just spit out a certain amount of base money every year, and that would be that. In other words, enforcing a strict monetary rule. And of course, the idea is you have this computer instead of an FOMC, you shut down the FOMC, there's a computer there, and the reason I put Dr. Strangelove up there is because the idea is you have this computer and no one has the key or anything access to it that could reprogram it. All right, so the whole idea is that Bitcoin technology is a way of having the Friedman computer solution, but having it be much more sophisticated and handle much more sophisticated possible supply algorithms than Friedman himself had in mind when he was writing at a time when computers weren't very well developed. A Taylor rule, of course, is a much different thing, precisely because, as you note, as long as you actually have a FOMC responsible for implementing a rule, you don't have a reliable rule at all. That's why, of course, rules, you used to talk about a fantasy world, right? All talk of monetary rules, insofar as it's talk of rules to be implemented by central bankers, it's all fantasy. We've never seen any such thing. And that's because central bankers can't help wanting to exercise discretion. You put a bunch of PhDs at a table, even if you put some bankers there to try to rein them in, they're going to want to use their brains to do something, you know, and it's and it's not usually going to be good, which is what Friedman taught us. So, we won't get central bankers, therefore, to say, oh, this Bitcoin stuff is great, let's just put that in place of us. But I think we should be talking ourselves about how that might not be a bad idea, right? If we do believe that the talk of monetary rules has any merit at all, we should be thinking about any technology that could actually make rules, such rules, implementable and strictly enforceable, and Bitcoin's one of those.
Yeah, if Garrick would like to.
Just briefly, I just wanted to let you all know I'm actually working on this and been thinking about this for quite a while, and have been speaking with a number of central banks around the world who are interested in this idea, who, unlike the Federal Reserve, actually would have good reasons to introduce a fully automated alternative or parallel currency that kind of leverages some of the Bitcoin technology. So we're going to be organizing a meeting in 2015 to kind of explore the theory behind this. It's going to be very sophisticated work that Gary alluded to that's going to need to be done to manage kind of a flexible supply that can do things like defend against speculative currency attacks, et cetera. But if you're interested in this, please get in touch.
One to Sam, what is the difference between the private key and your own password in accessing your Bitcoin account? And second, quickly, the question about how the IRS is handling this. They said capital gains, but is each individual account going to have to be kept separately? Like if I bought a cup of Starbucks coffee, do I have to keep a record of that to calculate gains and losses?
So I'll take the second one first and just say talk to an accountant or a lawyer. I'm not 100% sure, and as you guys are probably all aware, the IRS itself is probably not sure either. They don't know how to interpret their own rules often. So in theory, you would have to calculate the gains on pretty much every transaction, but in practice, I'm not sure. Your first question is about the difference in passwords and private keys. The private-public key pair are related to each other. You sort of have to have both for the system to work. They're both essentially random strings of numbers and letters. The private key itself gives you access to the Bitcoins on the blockchain by signing and having other people verify it. A password is just a way to restrict other people from accessing your data in a particular way. So you can use a private key without a password. You can use a private key with a password. But the private key itself is just a random string of data that correlates to the public key.
Oh, yeah, Garrick.
You were looking at me with your IRS question. I don't know if you sensed that my mother works at the IRS. She's actually retiring next week. But the IRS has issued guidance. You do have to keep track of basis in each Bitcoin you purchase, and even a use of Bitcoin for goods and services transaction is a taxable event in the U.S. That's not true in other tax jurisdictions. The UK has ruled that you can use Bitcoins for goods and services transactions like pounds, and it's not taxable. But in the U.S. right now, the rules are yes.
Right, do you have a person over here?
A question for Sam. You mentioned at the beginning one of your arguments is the liberty aspect of this currency. Yet in the first part of your demonstration, you showed these glass boxes, which were very transparent. You immediately moved into something that even for a person like me who's an actuary was extremely untransparent, and algorithms and who's in charge of what and who really founded this thing. Mt. Gox lost $600 million. Where's the transparency in that? Can you explain to me why we're not just replacing one tyrant with another in this process?
It's a great question. So, yes, the glass box analogy means that this sort of the blockchain, this public ledger, is viewable by everyone. And in that sense, you don't necessarily have much financial privacy, but Bitcoin is, it's called pseudonymous, right? Anonymous is what cash is, right? The cash in your guys' wallet is anonymous. No one knows how much there is. If you do a transaction with someone in cash, no one else knows about that except the person you're transacting with. That's anonymity in finance. Credit cards are the other way. Totally identifiable, completely 100%. Bitcoin's in the middle. So all these transactions are public, except your name is not attached to them. It's just sort of again, the public key is a random string of letters and numbers. So even though all the transactions are out there, they're not necessarily tied to your name. So you have some amount of financial privacy. But your question is transparency of maybe third parties. This is why it's important to reemphasize ownership of the private key is ownership of Bitcoin itself. If you give third party your private key, you no longer effectively own those Bitcoins. You have an IOU. It is just like using a bank. Right? The money in the bank right now is an IOU from them. You don't actually have it. Right? So what happened with Mt. Gox, Mt. Gox was the largest Bitcoin exchange, is that there were tens of thousands of people who were willing to put money into this exchange, a company operated in Japan, and let them own the private keys to their Bitcoin for them. Well, you can see why that's potentially problematic, because when the company folded because of technical problems on their own end, not Bitcoin, everyone lost the private keys were lost. Everyone lost their money. So I don't recommend you let third parties hold your private keys. The point is to hold the money yourself.
Right, do we have one on this side? We have one more, time for one more question. So, okay, we have one over here.
Thanks, that was an excellent presentation. My question is, taking this from the perspective that pessimists are only pleasantly surprised in life, two things I was wondering about. First, obviously this relies on electricity, and the whole planet isn't uniformly electrified, nor is it consistently electrified. Power goes out right here in Indiana periodically. And how does that impact your ability to utilize this money, or you want to call it currency at this point? And then the second thing is, what about parts of the world where the internet is not as open and is restricted by the governments of those nations, and could that affect the commerce that one can participate in with this type of Bitcoin currency?
So I'll attempt to answer that quickly. So on the first part about electricity, yes, it's dependent on the electrical grid and the internet, of course, itself, as is pretty much all financial systems today, right? I mean, your bank, if it doesn't have power, you're not getting your money out. So it's not really distinct, except for cash, right? Cash does, and gold, you could say, have those advantages. Moving forward, probably, hopefully, not going to be a problem. Hopefully, we have electrical grid and the internet moving forward. The places where it's restricted is an interesting one. Of course, China, the Great Firewall, and that sort of stuff. The people who use Bitcoin and who build Bitcoin are typically pretty technologically advanced, and they find ways around that, essentially. You may have heard of the Tor network, those kinds of things. It's a way to get around restrictions. Bitcoin is going to be able to get around those restrictions.
All right, with that, I'd like to have you join me in thanking our panel, and we'll be back in a little bit.
Thank you so much. That was really fascinating, and a lot of information there, a lot of good information. We have a break. You may exit through the back or the side. We have coffee out and some treats for you to refresh yourself. Please be back in here at 10:15. And I thank Gary, I thank Garrick and Sam and George. Marvelous panel. Thank you very much.